While a majority of Ainz's fight was exactly how we saw, a major element the anime couldn't quite show us was just how prepared he was. From the very moment Ainz had stepped into the arena, he was already taking steps to make victory more attainable. It was subtle moves like taunts and mind games that really went to highlight just how serious Ainz took his PvPing. So, just like I promised, let's finish off this episode and see how Ainz versus the Warrior King went in the novels. Very quickly before we get started though, I just want to remind you guys that you can still buy the Succube merch. That, the Nabe one and the Pleiades 6 stars one are all available for a limited time through the links in the description. Episode 43 Part 2, The Sorcerer King versus the Martial King. Starting things off with Ainz's initial challenge request, we find out that Gogin is only the strongest in the warrior division. Due to a previous match where mages just flew around shooting arrows and spells, the dull battle it created resulted in things like fly and teleport being prohibited. It was the only time Gogin had found himself losing. Now, a major factor causing Osk to be so reluctant was the potential damage to his reputation should an allied king get injured because of him. He didn't want to become known as that guy who allowed an allied nation's king to get hurt. So, in order to accept Ainz's request, Osk first demanded some form of collateral. He requested a weapon similar to what Ainz had just given Ainzak. This wasn't something that Ainz could give him right away, but he did agree and planned to have it delivered tomorrow. When Ainz went on to talk about his mass killing spell next, aside from the fact that the 10-year cooldown was a lie, it actually wasn't something he felt comfortable casting in the capital at all. Despite his impartial feelings towards anyone not from Nazarick, the amount of death it would cause was well past the line of what he was okay with. It was a small indication of whatever lingering sense of humanity he had left. Now, when Ainz had agreed to restrict the use of magic in the battle, there was actually quite a bit of pushback from Ainzak. You see, even with Ainz saying that he was fine with it, Ainzak still opposed the choice since Ainz had yet to see what the Martial King was capable of. He was sure Ainz was either overestimating his skills or underestimating Gogin. Either way, the level of pushback Ainz was getting here was actually quite refreshing. No one in Nazarick had ever gone to express their opinion the way that Ainzak did. It was a plea of genuine concern that he found to be quite welcome. In any case, it was after this that Osk had something rather interesting to say. Part of the reason he was so proud of Gogin was because, as a person who had no aptitude for combat yet carried quite the passion for it, creating a warrior to fight for him was the closest thing he could get to it. Sure, if he could have, he would have worked hard to make himself that warrior, but the body he possessed simply wasn't capable of it. So, what Osk did instead was create a warrior who represented him. That way he could feel as if it were him winning in the arena. Now, normally this wouldn't be that big of a deal, but the expression of satisfaction Osk was making right now made Ainz feel as if Osk had some sort of weird fetish with this. Even more so when Osk had said how if Ainz lost it would feel amazing for him. Now, a comment like this would have made anyone retort with one of their own, but when Ainz didn't respond with anything at all, that just left Osk and Ainzak feeling confused. They looked as if they were expecting him to say something more. But in the classic Overlord fashion, Ainz was more confused than either of them. He could clearly see in their expression that they wanted to say something, but pressing any more than he did would just diminish his position as ruler. It would start to make him seem quite foolish. So, what Ainz did instead was simply accept that this was how humans and society worked. He understood that if those without power revealed too much of their honest feelings, then it was only a matter of time until they'd be silenced for them, leading Ainz to just move on and end the conversation with the final details of the fight. Fast forward now to that exact day, and it's before the fight that we learn a bit more about Gogin. You see, as a war troll with innate strengths that made him powerful, Gogin had easily become the strongest warrior king in all of history. Not only did he possess tough skin and enchanted armor, but his inherent ability to regenerate was the toughest obstacle for all his opponents. Unless they were equipped with some form of acid or fire, making any sort of lasting damage on Gogin was impossible. Combine this with a magic ring and magic amulet, and what you get is a first-class warrior who's practically undefeatable. Now, part of what made Gogin's words so sentimental here was the fact that Osk had only ever heard it 3 times before. It was a rare occurrence that showed just how excited Gogin was for this. Not only was he excited though, but he was also trembling in fear over the opponent he was about to face. Every one of his natural instincts was telling him that this battle would be his last. If he got up and entered the arena, Gogin knew the only thing awaiting him there was death. But even so, Gogin saw this as the perfect opportunity to test himself. You see, despite being the strongest to ever enter the arena, Goguen knew all his strength came from the characteristics of his race. It wasn't because he was skilled or superior in combat, but instead simply because he was built different. Now that Osk had brought him someone his instincts were telling him to run from though, Goguen could finally test his true ability. It was the very thing he needed to confirm whether he was truly strong or not. And that was the final promise Goguen was grateful for. Now, if you're wondering how these two had met, well, that's a story that goes back a decade. It was 10 years ago that a powerful monster had appeared at the Imperial frontier. Not only was this monster said to be somewhat intelligent, but it was also said to not kill anyone who cast their weapons aside. A rather absurd rumor that had gone to pique Osk's curiosity. So, when Osk heard that Fluter would be sent to exterminate it shortly, Osk knew that he had to get there first. The thing is, it was when he finally did that he found himself too terrified to move. Only after Goguen glanced at him then looked away did Osk come to realize that the rumors were true. This monster was very clearly uninterested in him. So, with that being the green light to proceed as planned, Osk went and asked the monster a question. A question it responded to by saying it wanted to get stronger. It was as soon as that response was given that everything Osk had dreamed for was suddenly now attainable. Standing before him was the very thing Osk could train to become his stand-in warrior. The monster that would fight in his place so that he would know what victory tasted like. It didn't make much sense to Osk at the time, but the gamble he'd taken with Goguen had very clearly paid off now. Both him and his stand-in were now the champions of the arena. That being the case, it was only natural for Osk to be worried for him. I mean, after 10 long years of dominating the arena, the thought of it all coming to an end was at the very least troubling. Of course, Osk couldn't express those feelings to Goguen, but he truly was fearful that he would lose his friend today, leading him to only say those final words that we saw in the anime. What the anime didn't show us after this, though, was a final warning about Ainz's magic items, along with an earnest thought to lighten the mood a bit. It was a throwback to a next of kin discussion Osk had tried to have before. It's not really all that important, but apparently Osk did find a human candidate willing to mate with Goguen. Partly to become Goggen's wife, and partly to ensure a child that Osk could train for the future. Surprisingly enough though, a human wife wasn't even something that Goguen was interested in. No, aside from the fact that it likely wasn't even possible, he instead insisted that he'd find a wife that was his own race. Perhaps someone from the village he came from. Switching over to Ainz now, part of the reason he was so confident in his ability was because he was certain he was the strongest that he could be right now. After killing over 100,000 people in the massacre, even if each were only worth 1 experience point a body, the sheer number of them would definitely have been enough to level him up if he was capable of it. But because nothing had happened, Ainz knew for sure he was the strongest that he could possibly be right now. What he felt he could do instead though was refine his technique in other areas. Sure, his magic was certainly incomparable to anyone else, but if we're talking about his frontline skills as a warrior, then that was definitely lacking. After having fought so poorly against Clementine, Ainz knew he needed to work on his melee combat. He assumed that with his current ability, technique, and strategy, his overall level as a specialized warrior would be at most 33. So, having the opportunity to fight an expert like Goguen was by far the best way to test that. Now, there was something that did bring worry to Ainz's mind, and that was the fact that Jerkniv would be watching him. Ainz had hoped that Jerkniv wouldn't be in attendance, but the fact that he was made Ainz feel as if Jerkniv knew he was coming beforehand. So, Ainz now felt that he had betrayed Jerkniv's trust in a way that he needed to apologize for, resulting in a feeling of guilt which led him to go say hi. If he didn't at least greet the Emperor who was supposed to be his ally, then Ainz knew that that would only leave an even worse impression of himself. So that was the actual reason behind Ainz's masterful play against Jerkniv. Now, once we get to the actual fight, the equipment Ainz had brought with him was whatever his pure caster build would allow him to. Aside from several weak staves and daggers, his choice for physical attacks was this staff, a weak item he'd crafted back in his Yggdrasil days. Of course, Ainz could have just crafted a far more optimized weapon, but considering the disparity in power between himself and his opponent, it was only fair that he only use items already available to him, a decision that went against every teaching he had learned as a player in Yggdrasil. As for Goguen, the equipment he wore did match the description that Fluter had given him, but Ainz knew it was foolish to assume that it had the same stats. Reason being that back in Yggdrasil it was very common for PvPers to create a set of gear that looked the same, but was actually loaded with a set of data completely different from the original. It was a minor bluff that carried significant impact, leading Ainz to observe every aspect of Goguen closely. When he saw just how interesting Goguen was, the demand he made for him to become his subject after was immediately followed by a reminder for him to accept his resurrection. Should Ainz end up killing Goguen in the arena, then the choice to be brought back to life rested with Goguen alone. It would be extremely awkward if Ainz was attempting to display the power his Sorcerer Kingdom possessed, then failed to follow through simply because Goguen didn't accept his resurrection offer. Now, a quick advantage Ainz had tried to gain in the beginning was a slight antagonization attempt regarding their starting distance. You see, by accepting a starting distance that was within Goggen's attack range, Ainz was basically giving him a handicap. He was trying to get under Goggen's skin by expressing his underestimation of him. What went to impress Ainz even more though was that Goguen remained completely calm regardless. He was fully composed even with Ainz provoking him. So, after the bell had rung, Jerknev's initial cheers against him had actually made Ainz quite amused. He began to think his friend more fun than he thought he was, and that in turn led his perception of him to increase to even higher than it was before. Before he saw him more as this perfect emperor, but now he seemed like someone he could easily get along with. Ainz sensed an affinity between the two of them that just made Jerknev seem relatable. Getting back to the fight now, the initial hit Ainz had taken without his immunity had actually dealt a significant amount of damage to him. Though the pain was brief, the fact remained that he did very much feel it. When Ainz followed up with the negative energy attack of his own, he had also gone to use Goggen's ignorance against him. You see, he had made him think that if Ainz continued to touch him, then eventually the debuff would stack until he couldn't even move anymore. But while this debuff did continuously take away from his strength and agility, it would never actually make his stats hit 0. So yes, Goguen would get weaker, but the prospect of him eventually not being able to move was a small bluff Ainz added in to increase the pressure on him, making this the second time he had gone to do this. When Ainz had said that he was an immensely powerful race of undead, that was his first attempt to make Goguen anxious. So not only was Ainz increasing his advantage through attacks that countered his race, but he was also using his words to get into Goggen's head, a major aspect of this fight which would have both trying to filter through the other's deceptions. Now, the reason Ainz didn't follow up with another attack after was because he couldn't rule out the possibility that Goguen was intentionally letting his guard down. It was very possible he could just be faking his weakness and waiting for Ainz to get close. So, after a period of close observation, Ainz continued his assault with Clementine's stilettos now. And while he was indeed trying to imitate her exact stance, the most he could copy was her running style. He wasn't even able to replicate the agile dodges that she'd once used against him. What he could do to make up for that though was implement a skill which would make Goggen's attacks slower. You see, by using Despair Aura 1 to cause a delay between Goggen's brain and his physical action, Ainz could instill a brief type of stasis that would make dodging simple. So, despite Goggen's club making a course straight for Ainz's chest, the hesitation caused by fear allowed Ainz to dodge then connect with his own attack, one that was followed by an immediate release of magic spells Fluter had enchanted into them. While this was only intended to weaken him, the other two stilettos were meant to be fatal. You see, as a precaution in case Goguen was immune to fire, Ainz had also gotten Fluter to enchant these other two with acid magic. It was a surefire method to kill Goguen should the circumstances call for it. So, after Goggen's last counterattack against Ainz, he had dropped his armor in hopes of using his increased speed to end it. Sure, it was useful in blocking the stiletto's attacks, but because there was nothing he could do about the debuffs, Goguen felt it was best to just ditch it. That way he could do one last barrage of attacks and try to finish off whatever little HP he thought Ainz had left. When Ainz walked through all his attacks as if they were nothing though, that's when Goguen came to understand their true difference in power. What Ainz simply attributed to a mass disparity in their HP, Goguen could only see it as him being weak. So, with no choice but to accept his fate, Ainz unleashed the acid spell which killed Goguen instantly, thus bringing an end to the fight between the Sorcerer King and the Warrior King. Now, one last thing to quickly mention after is the comedic level of anxiety Ainz had prior to resurrecting Goguen. I mean, as an entity who was just declaring how he could defy death itself, it would have been pretty embarrassing if he couldn't prove it. That's why Ainz's non-existent heart was pounding in the moments leading up to it. But yeah, that was pretty much everything that we missed from the fight. It was a pretty faithful adaptation of what was an otherwise epic battle. There was a bit more to be said about Jerknev's demoralization after, but the essence of his downfall was captured about as well as you could expect it to be. So I think that's where I'm going to end up leaving things. If you enjoyed what you saw, then be sure to leave a like and comment. But as always, thank you so much for watching, and if you enjoyed this type of anime content, then you already know what to do. So, until next time.